Have you noticed that politicians struggle to enact the things they run on? That regardless of who wins elections, lawmakers cannot pass whatever legislation they like. This is the Overton window at work. The idea, coined by the Mackinac Center's Joe Overton, describes the range of ideas that are politically acceptable at any one point. And on the Overton Window podcast, we look at issues as they go from being unthinkable to plausible to policy, and talk to the people who change what is politically possible. Now, in America today, I think you would find it weird if your state government said that we're all practicing Methodists now and we're going to police you to Methodist precepts. Such a thing was not unthinkable at the start of America's founding, but America's founding did help create a distinct religious or distinctly American flair for religious liberty. And to talk about this, I'm joined by Professor Glenn Moots. He is the professor of political science and philosophy at my alma mater, Northwood University. Go Timberwolves. Glenn, welcome.
Thank you. So good to be here, and good to see you again, James.
How religious were Americans during the War for Independence?
So there's some controversy about that. It kind of depends on what you're looking at, where you're looking at it. I think it's fair to say
diversity of people in 13 colonies.
Right. I think it's fair to say very religious, and certainly you could say relatively speaking, compared to say later times. But certainly the church was a very important institution of civil society. You did still have a few established churches kicking around, which basically meant some kind of taxpayer support. You certainly had some other kinds of establishment, which I think, to your point, reflects the religious character. For example, Sabbath laws or blasphemy laws. Those are, I think, something that we would be hard-pressed to find today. There are still some kicking around, but I think all of that speaks to the religious character of early America.
I guess how much was so we have in America today a separation of the church and state. That did not exist back then. How religious were the states?
Yeah. It's what constitutes separation. And I think people would be surprised to learn that even, I would say, especially in New England, which we tend to think of a place where there was no separation, there was actually quite a bit of sensitivity to the separation of church and state. For example, ministers typically would not hold office, which is not to say they didn't have what we would call prophetic voice. In other words, it wasn't as if they were not influential. It wasn't as if they didn't speak to politics. In fact, there were occasions where ministers were expected to speak to an audience on a political occasion, and they would speak to things like...
Wait, really?
Oh,
how did that work?
Absolutely. So, one popular occasion was the gathering of, we could just call them civil magistrates, to sit under the minister, typically on the occasion of the appointment or the election of officers.
Okay.
Another would be if you had a gathering of the militia, for example. And so in the French and Indian War...
We're gathering the militia. We might have some things to talk about. Let's hear from the minister first.
Right. And, of course, that's not anything that would strike us as terribly unusual insofar as we have chaplains still in the military.
Sure.
There's some controversy about that today. Was there controversy then? That's a good question. I think Mel Smith at Hillsdale is writing on chaplains in the military. He's going to be coming out with something soon. But anyway... The idea of the prophetic voice of the minister speaking to the magistrate, he didn't have any legal authority, but he had a kind of moral authority. And so he might, for example, speak to the importance of good character of a magistrate, or he might speak to the essential role of the magistrate. The magistrate should always do this. And to your point about religious liberty, early on, that was understood to be protecting the souls of the people more explicitly. Later, that would include preserving what was called liberty of conscience. So there was still a charge there, and it was understood to be a religious charge. In other words, it was a charge having to do with piety. It wasn't just a moral charge, but it was a moral charge too.
Because piety is part of morals.
Right, right. We're reading the Gorgias in class, and we're getting toward the end of it. And Socrates says, virtue consists of justice, which not only includes acting rightly towards your fellow men, but reverence toward the gods. Now, it's almost like a throwaway because there's so little about the gods in the dialogue. Nevertheless, that idea of reverence and piety, you think of, for example, the Aeneid. I mean, it's all over the ancient world. It's just all over everything.
You almost tempted me to get into a discussion of some of the things that I caught in those philosophy classes about Socrates' divine inspiration, claims like that. But I'm not taking the bait. What I'm going to do instead is ask, again, about forming the American culture and the American culture that brought about the revolution. You had an article where you're talking about some of that, one of which was the role of church in helping form the bounds of political life. Like, you get your news from the or on Sundays. You get some of your moral interpretation of what's going on Sundays. But what was going on then?
Yeah, potentially the pulpit could be a source of news. Of course, there were newspapers. I mean, we know even in the ancient world, news traveled fast.
Yeah.
And in the colonial world, certainly news traveled fast. Might have been some lag across the Atlantic for what was going on in Britain, but even once it got here, news traveled very fast. I think that the ministers...
But the other thing I learned from your piece is that sermons also traveled fast.
Oh, yeah. So sermons could be printed. People would take notes. That was actually part of the obligation of sitting under a sermon, was to take notes. And down in the, I'm trying to remember the name of the library, Bentley, I think, down at University of Michigan, they have a journal kept by one of the parishioners in the Brattle Street Church, which is kind of a famous church. I could riff on that some other time. And it's notes taken. And John Adams took notes, and he will write to Abigail, for example, when he's out of town, and he'll refer to his notes that he took on sermons. So you would go to the sermon, you would take notes. Sometimes the sermons were printed, in which case they, could... which sermons would be published? The ones that would sell, right? And so if you had a particularly important occasion, or maybe if you had something that the publisher might think was particularly interesting, or the person who gave the sermon is pretty... Anyway, so you had these sermons that might travel fast. But here, I think, was to your point about what the sermon was for. The sermon was there to interpret the events. Almost like... Yes, kind of like 24-hour news is today. I feel really bad about this, and this is being recorded, so this is going to haunt me the rest of my days. But the pastor was sort of journalist, but mostly commentator. Now, what kind of commentary was he offering? Probably not, like, a minister wasn't going to talk about particular political factions necessarily. What he was going to do was he was going to put a gloss on it, so that it fit into some kind of
broader religious conflict or moral reckoning. Sorry, interrupting.
No, it could be moral reckoning. It could be what scholars wrote about. You see a lot in the 18th or 17th into the 18th century, the Jeremiad. So the Jeremiad was the calling people to repentance. Okay. We've done things that are wrong. God is punishing us. God is trying to get our attention. We're going to bring judgment on ourselves. This was an argument for some of those establishment hard or soft things that we talked about earlier. That might be part of it. Another might be, especially into the 18th century, kind of a gloss on, I won't say it's redemptive history, like it's the work of Christ is advancing, the soteriological, salvific, the saving work of Christ is moving forward. Maybe it would be the saving work of the British Constitution is moving forward. And so as rights and liberties are being protected or expanded, that's a kind of redemptive work. You see more of that in the certainly in any time there was a war between British Protestants and Roman Catholics, especially the French, for example. There, the minister might say, okay, we have this mission and it's going up to conquer some fort in what is now Canada. And we have these reports. Now, let's talk about who died. And then there was a kind of like martyrology. This is someone who died for the British constitutional Protestant cause. They became martyrs of a sort. Or it's important that we reform our behavior in the wake of this defeat so that we don't continue to bring judgment on ourselves. That sort of thing.
Okay. How did that factor into the Americans wanting a revolution?
Yeah, so certainly there were loyalist ministers. I should take this occasion, by the way, to plug Political Sermons of the Founding Era, which Liberty Fund published back in the early 90s. It has been reissued as a 2-volume, but that was put together by one of my mentors, Ellis Sandoz, who went out to the Huntington Library long before we had the digitization. So the only place you would get these sermons would be in what was called the Evans Collection, which was based on the New England historical societies. The New Englanders were like hoarders of historical stuff. And their historical society
Still are.
Absolutely. And it was like a crazy amount of stuff relative to the other colonies, which really shaped our whole view of American history, because so much of it is New England, and so much of the colonies,
or revolutionary portion of the country.
Right. And so we tend to view early America, Virginia is super important, but we tend to look at it through the lens of the New Englanders and New England history. But anyway, there were loyalist ministers, for sure, but there were a lot of patriot ministers. Ellis put a few loyalists in the book. John Wesley, by the way, is an example, and that was not a good look for him to be a loyalist. And but anyway,
although wasn't Wesley in Britain at the time commenting on the American experience, or am I mistaken in that?
Yeah, Wesley is not here commenting on it, but there, of course, is always stuff being printed, and it's going back and forth. A lot of the ministers, certainly the extant sermons that we have, are patriot ministers, and that was a combination, I think, to your question, of a political rhetoric and a religious rhetoric. Because in that Whig, call them Whig histories now, okay? Whig history is like, I'm going to explain to you why this is progress. And the progress is the progress of freedom. So the story you would tell, it's very interesting because I have a piece on Samuel Cooper. It's available online. And I'm trying to remember what the title is. Anyway, Cooper actually delivers sermons during the French and Indian War. And then he just modifies the sermons for the American Revolution. And I saw this. I mean, I spent months on a project where I went through all of his original sermons. And some of them, he just took out the sermon and just redelivered it like 20 years later.
Although that sounds like it's less I'm inspired by the precepts of my religion and more of these outsiders are coming after us.
Yeah, I think it was that the French, the Roman Catholic French, were the threat in, say, 1753, 1750, in the French and Indian War, and then the British became the threat to liberty. And yeah, you're right. It was basically the same political rhetoric. It was not a deep scriptural exegesis. Like one of the most popular sermons, there's a book by James Bird, and he does a study of all the sermons that we have. I think probably all the digitized ones, which is quite a few. And then he says, what were the most popular texts from Scripture? And of course, one of them is, I think it's from Galatians, the freedom that we have in Christ.
Okay.
Now you might say, well, okay, like Luther talked about freedom, or like Hooker talked about freedom.
I was going to say there's no government that can quelch that either. But
right. And so this whole question of the freedom of the Christian, that was talked about a lot for a long time. And now it just kind of turns into political freedom.
Okay.
Rights and liberties, as the British would have said, and then the Americans said.
Yeah, tied in with self-determination, which is the big part of the war for independence.
Self-government.
Yeah.
Yeah. We govern ourselves. We pay our own taxes. We decide our own taxes. We have our own legislatures.
So if these ministers were so central to political life in the Americans' founding, why are there so few ministers who signed the Declaration?
In part because of, remember I said Americans are actually quite sensitive to the separation of church and state?
Sure.
You had so few ministers who were also serving in those civil capacities. So part of this was a principle in certain traditions that magistrates should not also hold office.
Okay.
So from our perspective, looking back, it seems...
It's a very modern concept, by the way.
Yeah, it seems like, from our perspective, when we see taxpayer establishments, blasphemy laws, mandatory church attendance, things like that, we say church and state, well, they just collapsed in on each other. But from their perspective, and there's actually quite a bit written about this. John Cotton writes about it in the American colonies. Johannes Althusius wrote about it in the early 17th century in sort of the Calvinist part of Germany. They're very sensitive that the magistrate should never assume that he has responsibilities, that he has control or authority over the souls. That was always reserved to the churches. The churches prophesy. I don't mean they go into some sort of ecstatic thing. I mean, they preach the word, they administer the sacraments, they administer church discipline. The magistrate handles the civil affairs. And the problem with pastors becoming magistrates, which just means having civil office, was that it blurred that line. So you actually, and look, if you're a minister, you've got a prophetic voice. You're a central part of civil society.
Okay, even without holding office.
Yeah. Do you really need to do that? So you had these very important people, many of them independently wealthy, aristocratic, who had these civil offices, who were easy picks to go. Witherspoon is somebody who was an exception to this as a minister who had this kind of civil influence. I'm trying to think of some others, but yeah, you're right.
Two when I looked it up, but I could be mistaken.
Yeah, Witherspoon. There may be somebody else, and yeah, I should know, but
that's all right. But that's an interesting thing, just because I mean the wealthy merchants and lawyers who were engaged with the state infrastructure, and if you're already precluding yourself from that state infrastructure by being a minister, obviously you're not showing up in Philadelphia. So I do want to cover again this evolution of religious liberty, which you said we already had a lot of tastes for it at the start of the country. How does it go from we have established state religions to no, this is completely in the realm of the personal and the realm of the individual conscience?
Right. I think there was always an understanding that the conscience could not be changed by the law. I think that was a long-standing principle. And I think one of our great confusions, which is why we rarely have...
But that also kind of makes sense where it's like, okay, but blasphemy is starting to blur that line because you're speaking out against these things. So you may have made a conscious decision to reject it in a way that's I guess, offensive to the broader society who hasn't made that choice.
A good way to understand it in the law is to read the Ruggles case, where Justice Kent upholds a blasphemy conviction, and it's well worth reading. And there was another case in another state where something similar happened, and I can talk about that if you want to sidebar that for a second. But even in places where there was mandatory church attendance, there was no confusion that those people were going to be converted by the law or by the requirement. So the justification for this was largely civil. So it was not, if we get these people to go to church, they're Christians. Nobody believed that. Would they maybe more likely be Christians? Well, if you take your kids to a baseball game, unless you make it a miserable experience, they're probably going to like baseball. So if you grow up in the church, you grow up in this community, hopefully, everything is going according to plan and you're encouraging the work of the Holy Spirit, which they all thought was where conversion really took place. So the conscience was always understood to be a realm that the magistrate could not think he could really, hammer into the form that he wanted. But what he could do was he could encourage piety. Piety is conducive to conversion. Impiety, blasphemy, not conducive to conversion, right? You hear enough people running around mocking God and you think, it's not that important. So even in those cases, which strike us again as this collapse of church and state, there was always an understanding that the conscience was beyond the realm of the magistrate. And I could give you a quote. I'll send you a link, where John Cotton says that very explicitly, and Althussi says it very explicitly. So there were these, I would say, conditions conducive, but would never have been confused with conversion. Now, having those rules become more difficult when you have people who have differing opinions. And how does that happen?
Oh, and cultural expectations that we're not going to have the same opinions about these matters. Right. And now that we've got 13 colonies in a single country, we're going to do things differently in Massachusetts than they do in North Carolina.
Right.
The Carolinas.
One reading of the First Amendment, which I think is very plausible and defensible reading, is that, and I wouldn't say this is the only way to interpret it in a way that's sort of exclusive of other readings, which I think are compatible with it, is, to your point, you can't have a federal establishment so long as you have state establishments. Federal establishments would step on state establishments. And you would also run afoul of whatever problems you had with the state establishments. So it was just a bad idea for two reasons. One is, all of the problems that come with any establishment, you have to sort out who's paying what, to whom, how much, when.
As in, when you have an established state church, the people have to pay that church.
Yeah, and so there were controversies like, well, you don't have to support this denomination, but you have to pay into this fund which will support all of the denominations, or you have to support your denomination. But what you can't do is withdraw financial support and just leave it on its own, because then you tempt a lot of impiety. People don't take it seriously and so on. But back to your point about how we sort of got here was, as we'll just call them dissenting sects, denominations, we'll say, begin to proliferate. And the Quakers are really
I thought they were big in Pennsylvania, or do they just become bigger over time?
Yeah, well, Penn is a Quaker. There are Quakers there. Penn believes in religious liberty. But Quakers, for example, in New England are bad news.
Okay. Yeah.
And remember that the early Quakers were more disruptive So they would disrupt other people's services. They would, some of them, I don't know how much this happened in America, but they would walk around naked as a way of displaying their nakedness before God. This is a way of making a point. I mean, you can imagine how this went over.
Yeah.
So even Roger Williams, who was one of the big proponents of religious liberty in the colonial world, couldn't stand the Quakers. He's like 70 years old, rowing across the bay, like some, 17th century Schwarzenegger, to do like theological battle with these guys because he can't stand their theology. But nevertheless, he is so intent on making sure we don't persecute the godly, that we don't shed blood for Christ's kingdom, a whole bunch of points that he articulates very, very well. He believes that we should encourage religious liberty. Now, from a like 20th century, mid-20th century standpoint, around the time of the Everson decision, 47 and further, people look back to Williams and they say, this guy's the founder of religious liberty. He's not. At the time, Rhode Island, which was his colony that he founded, he wasn't the only one, was very unpopular. So people called it a sink or a latrine into which all of the other colonies emptied their heretics.
Oh.
So if you had trouble with a religious group, you just say, go to Rhode Island. Go cause trouble there. So Rhode Island had a pretty bad reputation. The Baptists, who were another dissenting group, much closer to the mainstream than the Quakers, they went to Rhode Island for a while. Some people even called Roger Williams himself a Baptist. He really wasn't. Why did Williams believe in religious liberty? Here was like the Puritans who opposed him. Okay, the Puritans believed that the church was holy, hopefully as holy as you could get it, and the world was not holy, and so the goal of the church was to mix in with the world and make the world better. Williams believed that would flow back in a bad way. And in fact, the more you presume to increase what we today would call cultural Christianity, which Russell Moore and others have said is bad, which is kind of a Baptist thing to say, by the way, we can circle back around to that. But there was a kind of hypocrisy. All these people in church, really? And a lot of them are just there because you tax them if they don't go. You know what this is? Stench in God's nostrils.
Okay.
This is filth. And God doesn't like this. And we need to get all these hypocrites out of church and make sure the only people there are the people who mean it. So if Williams was talking about school prayer today, his argument would be not, well, you're imposing on their conscience. His argument would be, why do you have these children offering up mandatory, filthy prayers to be stench in God's nostrils? I don't think anybody put that in the majority decisions in the religious liberty cases. So there were all kinds of different arguments that were promoting this. But the last thing I'll say is what really moved it forward? Policies about trade-offs.
Really? Like what?
And what sort of moved the Overton window in this case is, I like to say it this way, you can only hang so many Quakers.
Wait, were they hanging Quakers?
Yeah. They send the Quakers are causing trouble. They send the Quakers out. The Quakers come back. They send the Quakers out. They bring the Quakers come back. The Quakers are pretty determined. So there are some hangings, and of course, King gets word of this. Really what happens, and if you go back again to Johannes Althusius writing in the Calvinist part of Germany, there's nobody really in America when this is written, if you failed early settlements. He says, look, if you, in trying to impose a kind of religious uniformity or homogeneity or piety, whatever we want, those other words are like social science words. If you're trying to do this and you're causing civil disruption, stop. Because the peace of the state is very, very important. And so as dissenters proliferate, What are you going to do? You going to line them all up and hang them? No. You're going to put them all in jail? No. By the way, what's happening is you're doing that. How do people who are like nominal, customary believers, what do they think is your...
You get intensified when you see things like that. And persecuting people on the other side is not a way to strengthen conviction for yourself or for your side.
Right. So it just becomes really unworkable. So I would say if you would have asked the people at the time, how do you feel about this new religious liberty, which is greater than toleration? Toleration is like, we'll put up with you. Liberty is like, you're as good as everybody.
Toleration is, you're wrong, but we'll let you live, or we'll let you go ahead. Whereas liberty is like, okay, we all have to figure it out ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And so you start with intolerance, you move to toleration, you move to liberty. You do get to a point, even by the 1690s, which remember is after the English Bill of Rights and the Glorious Revolution, you get a kind of pan-Protestantism, which is, look, we got to stop being divided as Protestants. We have to unite. There are just bigger fish to fry.
Even the Puritans and the Anglicans.
Right. Yeah. So you do start to get, by the 1690s into the early 1700s, sermons praising liberty of conscience. And this now becomes a new British, liberty. But we didn't get there because everybody just woke up in the morning and said, I got a really good feeling about this. This is gonna be great. Because if you look at like what Locke is doing and what he's writing on, a lot of people were like, Locke was writing against religious liberty not long before he was writing in favor of it. Mm. And now the second thing he published, the first he didn't, which they're called the Two Tracts. And he had an essay on toleration too in the 1660s. I think it was 1660s. Anyway, part of what's happening is the way people thought religious liberty was going to work politically was just going to be a disaster. I mean, it was just going to be chaos. You were going to have all these people. They were going to have all these religious differences. It was going to make for very bad civil society. It was going to make for various kinds of rebellion and dissent. Mm-hmm. And then
probably even some localized violence between the different groups next town over.
Right.
So you can't hate anyone as much as you can hate your neighbors.
That's right. Yeah. And so one of the reasons that people supported it was because they didn't think it could be any other way. Mm-hmm. But then people go abroad. And of course, Holland was an example where they saw a diversity of professions. And they thought, this is actually working out okay.
No, professions being religious
professions. Yeah, right. Not a vocational. And so that helped. So a lot of it was just, look, if we continue to drill down on this, we're not going to like where we get. This is going to become a stupid game that wins stupid prizes. And we've got to just realize the reality, the sort of facts on the ground. And that reality, moves that Overton window to where you can begin to entertain various kinds of toleration and eventually religious liberty.
So I guess let's talk about the thing that you don't see. Why wasn't, the early 19th century just riven with sectarian conflict in the Americas?
Yeah, I think Miles Smith, again, at Hillsdale, his book is called Religion and Republic. I just reviewed it for University Bookman, which is published by the Kirk Center. He has a really good argument. He doesn't keep hammering it, but it's very clearly in there. What disestablishment did, that is to say, taking the state entirely out of the denominational preference business. Mm-hmm. There were still blasphemy laws and Sabbath laws and things like that. There's a big controversy over delivering the mail on Sunday.
All right, yes.
So there were kind of fights like that. Some people really took offense that other people took offense at delivering the mail on Sunday. Mm-hmm. And that was like, just drop it, it's not important. So you did have those kinds of battles. Mm-hmm. But what actually happened was as you got the government out, you got that pan-Protestantism that I talked about earlier, where, think about, say, a land-grant state university. University
Which
of
are,
Michigan.
and every state's got one of these. They're the big state universities. In Michigan, it's Michigan State Universities. Alabama, it's the University of Alabama. Those big state ones are the land grant schools. Yep.
Well, the University of Michigan was founded in the wake of the Northwest Ordinance. And if you look at Angel Hall, there's this quote from the Northwest Ordinance about religion being important. It's right in front, as you walk down State Street. That statement in the Northwest Ordinance enabled the creation of the University of Wisconsin, the University of Michigan, and other state universities. And then later, the land-grant universities. And so this idea of the government supporting higher education, it's been around a long time. But the notion of these universities in their founding iterations, Smith talks about this, is they looked a lot like seminaries. There was a real...
Well, they should. Like, that's if you're going to teach people about the higher education, your models have to come from seminaries because those are the people who are doing it.
Well, of course, there was an exception to this. Now, of course, the German model hadn't crept in yet, but the one exception to this was the University of Virginia, Jefferson's University, which was very controversial because he didn't want to have the same kind of theological training, for example, that the universities have. But the reason they look like seminaries was because they so emphasized character. And of course, to a largely Protestant America, part of informing character was religious instruction, was some kind of theological instruction. And there was this emphasis on the character of the faculty, for example, and things like that. So by clearing away worrying about whether the Baptists were legal or whatever, you could potentially say, well, he may be a Baptist, but he's an upright man. Whereas maybe before, when Baptists were illegal, for example, you just say, he's a Baptist, he's out. And now you could kind of take away those differences and just focus on the sort of the nub, of the thing.
So, well, let's kind of talk about the germ of the idea into practice. Why was the case against blasphemy upheld? Back to the thing you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Part of it was Kant's argument is that that Christianity is part of the common law, and of course, common law is this notion of tradition. It is something that in the course of life we have long preserved. And so that's part of his argument. Part of his argument is, and this is very interesting, believers have rights. And you're not blaspheming, like say you were in a classroom. And in the classroom, there was a discussion about atheism. You were reading a prominent atheist. And so the professor says, or the teacher says, make me some good arguments for atheism, and then we're going to kick them around and talk about them. This was just a gratuitous, malicious statement. And the people who are listening is a kind of violation that takes place there of their rights. And from a civil perspective, this undermines the good character that enables a good polity. So,
when was this again?
1820, I want to say 1828, 1819.
Yeah,
Go back and look.
So in at least that early 19th century American thing, where we do have constitutional principles like the freedom of speech and non-establishment of religion, but still it's a portion of the character. When did that change? I'm not to put you on here as a legal historian.
Yeah. No, I would say that it probably fades away. I'm going to say sometime in the 20th century. Now, whether it fades...
It's a long path.
Whether it fades because it's simply not enforced or whether it fades because it's deliberately repealed is a good question. And you remember the case of the cussing canoeist.
I'm
Here in
unfamiliar with the
Michigan.
status of the Custine Commission.
Oh, you have to go look it up. And again,
I might have heard about it now
okay.
that you mentioned.
This is a guy. He's at some. I don't know if he's at a state park or county park or what. And I think
all the rivers of Michigan are owned by the state, and they are commons.
Okay, so I think he falls out of his canoe or something, and he just lets loose with a stream, and he gets cited for it, and it goes to court, and it's something like cursing in the presence of women and children.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he won.
Yeah.
In challenging it. And I think the most plausible argument would be you haven't enforced this law in 65 years or whatever. So it kind of loses its force as a law, which is a, principle of legal or political philosophy.
Well, so I do want to say that at least to go back to another kind of a contrary thing, why isn't this happening? Do you think like that concept that you talked about, like, got built up out of the American tradition, that there is a difference between, your arguing for your soul and then arguing over civil matters. I think there's still an element too, though, of the opposite that goes through history, which is, if these things are so important, if this is the right and the true religion, we really ought to make sure that people are abiding by it. Like, that still exists. Where does that exist, even in America? Like, or at least what? Yeah.
So here's a, as the kids say, a hot take on this. Yeah. Okay, which is, I'll say it this way: you'll always have blasphemy laws.
Okay, what do you mean?
There's a kind of public piety that people just intuitively understand is important. There are certain values that we cannot just confine to. Wolf James believes that that's fine.
Oh, let me at least try and say something, which is, without necessarily all coming together and agreeing about something, we're all going to think that there's a couple of things, there are some things that are over the line and we're not going there, which is synonymous with those religious ideas that ask for a state church.
Yeah, I think that there are certain, we'll call them proprieties. Did you read Cicero with me?
No, but I did read it by myself.
Okay, good. So
shortly after college, not in college.
Yeah, which might have, if you read it with me, it would have been great. Most colleges would have been terrible. Okay, but Cicero talks about proprieties, and he says proprieties are felt more than understood, right? That idea. I have a feeling this crosses a line.
Yeah.
And if you think about, for example, what would be one of those things in America today? Burning the flag. A lot of Americans would say, I'm all for free speech, but that's a little much. There's something impious about it, right? The flag is a symbol. Probably veterans would be even more sensitive to this because they lived in a culture where the flag rises, everybody comes to attention, you lower the flag, everybody comes to attention, you fold the flag a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So there's kind of reverence for the flag. There's a kind of a common impression we all have as Americans that there's something called human dignity, that people are entitled to a certain degree of respect and acknowledgement, right? And this has now become a cornerstone, first of race, which I think is very, very salutary. And now it is something which is far more controversial, of course, which is gender, right? And so there's a kind of piety about what may be said or thought or argued. Years ago, it was just after Obergefell, so it was a little moot in a way. Pardon me. I had Ryan Anderson and I think it was Ilya Shapiro, and the debate was, is gay marriage good for America? Now, looking back, of course, this speaks to Northwood's ability to have public events, which might strike some as impious without having a riot, which is great. But I don't even know that you could entertain that question in a debate on most campuses, not only at the time, but certainly today. It's become a kind of piety. And if you look at some other Western countries, Britain is certainly one, where you may not blaspheme the pieties, right? We have these cases of comedians getting arrested and people sharing things on social media and getting arrested and things like that. So the hot take is you're always going to have blasphemy laws. You're always going to have pieties. What you have to do is manage it privately and publicly. Of course, privately is better than publicly. But in a way, it's almost a little more tyrannical, right, than public, right? You have to manage so that people have the right proprieties.
As in more tyrannical, as in private life, you can't even hold these thoughts. But in public life, we're going to punish you if you hold these thoughts, but that's all we can do.
The funny thing is whoever thought these were good laws in Britain, or Canada, by the way, Canada's going a little nuts on this too, is those laws probably reflected a growing public sentiment that these were bad kinds of speech. In other words, you shouldn't say these things about those people. So there probably was something private that then became public. In other words, there was kind of a popular opinion that enabled the law.
But by the way, that makes a lot of sense with the thing that you meant, is that there's a sense that these are things that are over the line, which you feel without necessarily being able to persuade other people that that is inappropriate.
Yeah, like I'm just not comfortable with that. Okay. And so anyway, let's say a lot of people in Britain think to themselves, you shouldn't be allowed. That seems mean. I'm not comfortable with that. Once you see the comedian getting arrested, getting off the plane, then you might think, it's gone a little too far. Like, there's a way in which, and Tocqueville talks about this in Democracy in America, there's a way in which there's this tyranny that doesn't have anything to do with the government. It just has to do with the way we tyrannize each other through the proprieties, for example, right? Yeah. This certainly happens in fashion, entertainment. It happens in all kinds of areas. So you have this kind of private thing, then it turns into a law, and then everybody says, wait a minute. And sometimes that's the moment, that's the defining moment.
Well, there we go. We've covered a lot of ground, from religious liberties, some of the ideas that wound up having manifestations in laws years ago, the fact that there is really that we're always going to have some level of intoleration, even religious intoleration, with us, but also some of the ideas of how to push back on those. That's a lot of ground. So thank you for helping us understand.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
The Overton window.